we've got our fabric cut out, we've serged, and now we're ready to start sewing. And when we do that, we're going to rely on our pattern to tell us how we do it step by step. They try to write the instructions as simple as possible, but what they have done is, in addition to writing it, they also give you a picture. So after you read the instruction, look for the corresponding picture that shows you the illustration of what those words mean. So let's start by reading step 1. And you'll first look at your pattern to find the particular project that you're doing. So we're on pants, and step 1 says stitch front to back at inner leg seam. So there's an illustration on what those words mean. So if you don't understand the words, look at the picture. Now, if we're going to sew a seam, we need to pin it together first before we go to the sewing machine to actually sew it. So I have some instructions on how we pin our pieces together. I know that's more than one way to do it, but this is the way I recommend, and I always tell my students, what you do in the privacy of your home is your own business, but when it comes to pinning, you need to pin it my way. So we know that's very obvious that we can tell the difference between the front and the back of the fabric. And when you're pinning your pieces together, you want right side facing right side. Now the instructions said the front to the back. So right off the bat, I need to look at these pieces to make sure I'm going to sew a front to a back, that I'm not going to sew two fronts together or two backs together. And I have it marked with my painter's tape that I talked about in the last video, that I have marked whether it's a front or a back and what the pattern piece number is. So I'm going to take one front, and then I'm going to take one back, and right sides together. Inner leg seam is the seam that is below that center curve. So I'm going to take the two pieces, and you can just imagine if it were an adult size pattern, this would be much, much longer. But the process is exactly the same. So people just assume they're going to start pinning at one end and then they're going to finish up at the other end. Don't do that. You want to pin your ends first because you want to make sure that both ends are going to match. You don't want anything like this to occur where one is shorter than the other. So you place them right on top of each other, and it looks like one piece of fabric there, and your pin will be going perpendicular to your seam line. And what that means is this is the seam line. So the pin will be going in this direction. And notice, I'm going to do that again because it looks like this one piece is a little bit shorter than the other. All right, so we're going to put that pin back in there again. All right, so the pin is perpendicular, and you notice that the head of the pin is sticking out. I tell people if they bury it to pull it back out. You want to make it easy on yourself because you will be removing these pins as you're sewing the seam line, and you don't want to have it so that it would be awkward for you to get to. So we pin both ends first. So I'm going to come up here to this end, do the same thing. I want to get that right there where both pieces are together, like that. Pin head sticking out. So regardless of the length, you start at your ends. And then you just look at the length of it and just judge as to where the center is. And we're going to say that looks like the middle. Now you want to see that both edges are right on top of each other. And now I'm going to put a pin in there as to what I consider to be the middle. And we just continue to work that way. Here are these two pins. I'm going to say right there would be the middle between those two. And then between these two, we're going to put one more pin like that. So normally pins, I would say, are 3 to 4 inches apart, but it isn't necessary to measure. So I'm going to go ahead and pin the other two pieces together, and then I'm going to meet you at the sewing machine. Before we start, I'm not going to go through the process of explaining how to thread this machine or fill a bobbin, because each machine is unique in its way, and that I'm depending on you to know how to do that with your personal machine. But the one thing I do want you to be aware of is that we need to have a guide for our seam allowance. And your commercial patterns tell you that when you're making garments, you want to use a 5/8 inch seam. So where is 5/8 on your machine? Now, some machines are very good about having that marked on the throat plate. And when I say throat plate, I'm talking about this metal plate that's under the foot. But also, it's possible that you might have an older model and it isn't obvious where 5/8 is. So in that kind of a situation, I recommend that you take a tape measure and you slide it under the foot and you put the needle down right where an inch is. And then you go over to where 5/8 will be, which is, 2 marks past a 1/2 inch. And you can do a number of things. You could use painter's tape. You could use, this is a sticky notepad. Or I have something that will temporarily stick to the throat plate that I can slide on. But whatever you want to use, find some guide that you can create so that you can keep the edge of your fabric right in line, so all of your seams will be 5/8. Now we're going to be ready to start sewing. So when we start, I don't know if you remember or not, in the previous video, I talked about when you serged, how you wanted to line up the front edge of your fabric where the needles were to begin your serging. Well, we don't follow that same process with a sewing machine. Instead, we want to take that front edge that you're going to begin with and slide it past the needle. We don't want to have the edge of the fabric in line with the needle. Instead, we want to go past it about a 1/2 inch. And the reason I tell people to do that is because many times when you first start, that's where you can have issues with your sewing machine. And so this will eliminate that. So we get it past where the needle is, and then we can lower our foot and be kind to your machine. Don't drop your foot. Just lower it with your hand. All right, we lower our foot, and then we want that needle in the fabric. So if you have a needle down or needle up feature, then you can just touch the button. If you don't have that feature, then just take the flywheel on the right-hand side, turn it towards you, and get the needle in the fabric before you ever step on the foot pedal. Now, with this one, I'm all ready to start. I recommend this for all machines, regardless of the brand. Hold the thread that is coming from your needle. Hold that, and I want you to make 1 stitch. All right? Once you've made that stitch, you don't have to hold the thread anymore. And now we want to go in reverse first because we want to secure our stitches. So I'm really close to my pin, so I'm going to remove that pin. Don't ever try to take a pin out as you're running the sewing machine, because that could possibly cause you to sew your finger. So the first thing we're going to do is reverse. And my reverse lever is over here on the side, and I'm going to hold it down, and then I'm going to gently step on the foot pedal and go back to the edge. Now that I'm there, I don't have to hold on to that lever. Again, it's going to depend on your machine as to where the reverse is, whether you can touch it or whether you have to hold on to it. Now we're ready to come forward. And when we're sewing, we're always looking at the edge of the fabric. We're not looking at the needle. We're looking where the edge of the fabric is, because we want to make sure that that edge stays in line with our guide. Keep your fingertips here in front to guide your fabric. Don't put your hand behind it. Don't have your hands up close to the foot or the needle. Keep them about halfway between where the needle is and where the front edge of your machine is. So gently step on your foot pedal and sew at a nice steady pace. And wait till you get fairly close to where your pin is and stop. Make a complete stop, then remove your pin. Again, you do not want to be taking your pin out while you're sewing. Not a good choice. And we're just going to keep on going here till we get to the next pin, and then we're going to stop again, and we're going to take it out. And we'll continue to do that until we get all the way to the edge of the fabric. Have pleasant thoughts. Just think about how much fun you're having. Keep on going here. I'm going to pick up a little bit of speed. I don't recommend, especially new sewers, to be sewing very fast, because the faster you sew, the less control you have. So I'm going to take my right hand away because I'm coming near the end of the fabric, and I'm going to sew all the way down to the edge, right there, and I'm going to stop. I need to reverse again. If you don't reverse, those stitches will start to come out. So I'm going to hold on to the reverse and go back about 3 or 4 stitches. Then I'm going to come back to the edge again. Now I'm finished. With this particular machine, I have the choice of either using the scissor button here, or I can touch the foot pedal at the back of it, and it will cut the thread. I've cut my thread. I reach around, raise up the lever, pull this out, and before I do anything else, I'm going to take that thread that's from the needle, and I want to pull out, I don't know, about 6 inches. I want to have enough thread there that I don't have to worry about the fact that the next time I start to sew, that the thread isn't going to go out of the eye of the needle. I'll be all prepared for that next seam. So I'm going to go ahead and sew the other 2 pieces together, and I'm going to meet you at the ironing board. Now that we've sewn our inner leg seam, we need to press the seam open. It's really important that you press your seams as you're constructing the garment rather than waiting until after you're finished. Now, I do have rules about how you press. I have rules about everything, actually. Okay, so when we get ready to press our seam open, I am not using a steam iron. I'm just going to spritz it with a little bit of water here. And what I'm going to do is run the iron over it just to what we call set the stitches. So we've set the stitches first. Then we're going to open it up and take our fingers and open up that seam so we can have it out flat. And people think pressing is the same as ironing, and it isn't. So pressing is an up and down motion. So I'm just going to take the iron and I'm going to put it face down. Just hold it there for a few seconds. I'm not moving the iron. Then I'm going to lift it, and then I'm going to put it down again. Hold it for a few seconds, lift, and press again. So you're not moving the iron side to side, just straight down and up and down motion, just like that. And then you get a really nice flat seam. And if you want to, you can flip it back over and look on the front side and see that it is nice and flat. And if you want to give it another shot of pressing, you can. We've pressed both of our seams, and now we're ready to go to the next step. Before we do, we want to check off step 1. I think it's important that you do things along the way that's going to make it easier for you, because more than likely, you're not going to make these pajamas all at one time. It'll be at different times. So if you mark with each instruction that you have completed, you're going to know what you're to do next. So we have completed step 1. So I would just check that off. Now we're ready for step 2. And step 2 says, with right sides together, pin the center seam. Now I'm going to stop right there. That's not the complete sentence, but that is something we are to do. So we are going to pin our center seam. And it does give us an illustration on how you place your 2 pieces together in order to be able to pin them together. So it means that, remember I said earlier, you want right sides facing right sides. So I'm going to put one of the pieces right side up, and then I'm going to take the other one and put it right side down. And that, I'll turn this around actually. You can see the instruction sheet, and then I'm going to put it in the same direction as the pattern is showing. So here is the illustration on the pattern, and now I have my two pieces going the same as the pattern. Now when we pin this together, I recommend you start at your center seam, the one you just sewed. So I'm going to check, raise the first one up, see that that seam is going to be right on top of the one underneath. And then I'm going to pin on each side of the seam allowance. See, by having it pressed, that makes it much easier. The seams are pressed down, and we want them to stay that way. We do not want the seam allowance to get flipped over to one side. Then the next place I'm going to pin will be at the top edge. So both the front and the back, we want to get those pinned together with the pin head sticking out. Remember that, don't forget that. And then you remember how we said we look for the middle. So from the top edge to the center seam, I want to say, that looks like that's about the middle. So I'm going to put a pin in there. And then over here on this side, I'm going to do the same thing. Just make sure you don't have any wrinkles, any little puckers or anything like that. Put your pin in there, okay? Now, again, I said something about pins being 3 to 4 inches apart. Well, these might be a little bit closer because we're working with a smaller garment. But I'm going to continue to pin. Now, I know some people are not pinners, and some people like to use clips. So you have to consider what kind of fabric you're using as far as using clips. Now that we have it pinned, let's read the rest of the sentence on step 2. And it said, pin the center seam. And then it goes on to tell you to matching inner leg seams and notches, period. We've done that. We've got it all matched up and we've got it pinned. Then the next word is stitch. All right, that means we're going to go back to the sewing machine and we're going to sew a 5/8 inch seam. And when we do it, we're going to go from the top edge all the way around, going across that center seam and going all the way up to the top edge on the other side. Now I want to demonstrate to you about doing curves. So I'll meet you at the sewing machine. Now before we sew the center seam, I want to talk to you about sewing a curve. This is mainly for people who are new to sewing. So I'm just going to place the edge of this fabric right where my guide is and lower the foot and lower the needle just to talk to you about curves. Now, when we do a curve, we want it to be the same seam allowance width as when we're doing a straight seam. So now I want you to take your right hand and put it underneath your fabric and then have your left hand about 1 inch or so in front of your foot so that as you come to the curve, you will be able to hold the curved edge in line with your guide, all right? So all of that seam will be the same width. So the right hand will just hold it in place, and don't pull on your fabric because this is the curve, the stretchy part of your fabric, and so you definitely don't want to do any pulling. It's just to hold it up a little bit, keeping your left hand in front so that you can keep that edge in line with your guide. All right, so now we're actually going to do it. So I'm going to position the fabric again where, and remember, we don't put the fabric right at the edge of where your needle is. We're going to go past the needle about 1/2 inch, reach around, lower the foot. Again, we'll take a pin out because it's right there near that edge. Now the next step is holding our thread so that we will make a stitch. Now that we've made a stitch, we want to go in reverse because we want to secure our stitches. So let's just back up a little bit here. We're at the edge and now we're ready to come forward. So if you want to watch me do this curve, because this is the first time we've had to do a curve, that's going to be just fine. So I'm going to keep my fingers right here until I get to the curve. Now I'm looking right at my guide. That's where I'll focus my eyes. And that notch, that we cut out earlier, It's just hanging out there, and we're just letting it hang out there, all right? Now we've gotten close to a pin, so we remove it. So we're getting near to the curve. Now I'm going to stop and put my hand underneath here and keep my left hand on top, so I'm keeping that edge in line with my guide. I waited pretty long and waited right up till I got to the pin before I removed it. And now we're going to keep on going. And we're just in anticipation of where that is, that guide is. And we're getting there to where the seam is, and we have our pin, so I'm going to take those out. And now I'm going to follow that around. Again, got my hand underneath and one on top. Take your time. Don't be in a hurry. That's the big thing. You don't want to be in a hurry. This is supposed to be a relaxing activity. They say it lowers your blood pressure. It just is a very calming thing to do. Now, some people might not agree with that, but that's how I feel about it. All right, now we're on the straight part. So we keep our fingers here in front. And we just keep on going until we get to the edge. And I think you know what we're going to do when we get to the edge. We're going to sew all the way to the edge. Stop. Reverse 3 or 4 stitches. And then come forward. And we're going to cut our thread. All right. Now that we've done that, we're going to go back and read our directions. This step happens to be the one that many students tend to skip. And it's just the second half of step 2. We're going to go back and we're going to continue reading step 2. And it says, to reinforce the seam, stitch again over first stitching. Some patterns will say stitch maybe 1/4 of an inch from the seam, or it will vary. But we're going to do just what this pattern says. And it's telling us that we need to reinforce it. Now you don't have to watch me sew, but what I will do is I'm going to sew right over what I sewed before, but I'm only going to sew at the curve. I'm not going to do the entire seam. The curve is the important part. So I'm going to just re-stitch the curve section of this seam. And then I'm going to come back and we're going to read the rest of step 2. I've done my reinforcing, and now we're going to read the rest of step 2. And it says, trim seam in curved area to 1/4 of an inch. Well, we're not going to get a seam gauge out to measure to make sure it's 1/4 of an inch. I'm just going to take some scissors, clip into the seam, and trim only where I did the reinforcing. And that's so this will make it more comfortable. We're reducing bulk. We don't have to have all of that bulk in the pants. And we will have this seam reinforced where it's very important, so that if a thread should break, you're not going to have a hole in a rather personal place. The last sentence says, press remaining seam open. So what they're talking about is not what I've trimmed, but the other part of the seam will I'll press open. Now, we don't have to go back to the ironing board for you to see me press, because I've already demonstrated that. But I am going to take a little break and I'm going to go press, and then we're going to be ready to read the next step. We're going to check off step 2 now. We've finished it finally, and we're ready for step 3. And this says stitch front to back at side seams. Well, that's interesting, because people think that when they have stitched the center seam, the pants look like this, right? And that these are your side seams. But I asked them, well, if you pinned it up as it is right now, and this is the top of your pants, how do you think you're going to get into them? Because you know you're not going to fit with the way it is right now. So we want to sew our side seams, and I'm going to have to open this up and turn it around and place that face down. So if we're going to sew the side seams, we need to change the way we have our fabric. So I open up the leg, reach around and find the top edge of the other, or the back or the front, and then place them right side to right side. And now you see they look like pants, like this. So now we have our side seams. We saw the side seams before, but we had to reposition our fabric before we pin these side seams together to go to the sewing machine. I'm going to get this pinned together following the same process of pinning the ends, then pinning the middle, and keep working from the middle. And when I finish that, we're going to go to the machine. Okay, we're back at the ironing board. I've sewn the side seams, and I want to press those seams open. And the reason I want to demonstrate about how we're going to press those side seams is because we're going to use a sleeve board. But prior to doing that sleeve board, I'm just going to do a little spritzing here to kind of set those stitches. And then, now that I've set the stitches, here's our sleeve board. And you notice that the width of this leg is too narrow to be able to put it on the end of the ironing board. So that's where the sleeve board comes into play. See how that slides on there? That works really well when you've got something real narrow and you can't put it on the end of an ironing board. I opened up my seam, and now I can press my side seams. So this is a situation where you can't use just a standard ironing board in order to press these seams open. We're getting close to making our casing, but before we do, we need to do step 4. Step number 4 says to keep elastic from getting stuck in the seam allowances as it's inserted, use fusible web. Well, we're not going to use fusible web, and they have a picture here showing fusible web. So I'm just going to make a little X here because that's not what we're going to do. Or machine basting. That is what we're going to do. All right? And we're doing it because we don't want our elastic to get stuck in the seam allowance as we're putting it in. So this is a step that we're going to remove the stitches when we finish. It's just there to help us when we're putting in our elastic. To anchor them to the garment within the casing area, be sure to remove the basting after the casing is finished. So again, it's just saying what I just said, that we're going to take these stitches out when we're finished. Because up here at the top edge of your pants is where our casing is going to be. We don't need the tape on here anymore. We will be turning down this top edge to form a casing. And when we do that, we'll have elastic with our safety pin, and it would be very easy as we're taking it through the casing for the elastic to go underneath the seam allowance instead of being on top. And it's actually 2 places. It could be here or it could be up there. So we want to eliminate that happening. Now the casing is going to be folded down 1.5 inches because if you remember, you have elastic that's 3/4 inches wide. So your casing is twice the width of the elastic. So we don't really have to measure, but if you just kind of guess, this looks like it's about 1.5 inches. And then when you open it up, there's another 1.5 inches. So I'm just going to put a pin, arbitrarily put a pin where I think it's a little bit more than 3 inches. And then we're going to go to the machine, and I'm going to show you how you do it. So the first thing we want to do is find the center back. And remember, the back always has one more notch than the front. So I'm looking at the notches here, and now I'm going to look over here, and this is a triple notch. Over here is a double notch. So we're going to begin at the center back seam to do this, because I want to do one more thing. I want to break a couple of threads. So this will make it easier when we sew our elastic together, because I do vary sometimes the directions that the pattern has, because through the years of making garments, sometimes I think maybe my way might be better, just possibly. So I'm just going ahead and I'm breaking a couple of threads there So we're going to be putting our elastic in the center back seam. So I have that all ready before I go to the sewing machine to do the machine basting on the seam. So let's go over to the sewing machine again. Before we do the machine basting, remember the instructions said basting. And at the moment, my machine is set at a 3-stitch length. I need to change that to the longest stitch setting the machine will make. And in this case, it's 6. We want long stitches because we're going to take these stitches out. So we don't need little short stitches. And then another key point you want to know, if your machine has a thread cutter on it, you're not going to use the thread cutter when you're doing this step. So we want to sew from the top edge down to where the pin is. And the point is that we want to be as close to this edge as we can get. And to start out, and by the way, if you're a right-handed person, you want to do it on the right side of your seam allowance. If you're a left-handed person, you do it on the left side of the seam allowance. The illustration on the pattern shows it on both sides. Well, that's because they don't know if you're right-handed or left-handed. So I'm going to slide this under the foot and put it as close to that edge as I can get. And I want to make sure I don't sew it together just on this one seam. So I kind of make sure I open everything up like that. I want to hold on to this thread, and now I am close to the edge, both the upper edge and the seam allowance edge. And I'm going to make a stitch. All right, now I did that. Now I'm just going to continue right along that edge. I might go a couple more because I don't want to sew over the pin. I'm not going to touch that thread cutter. Instead, I'm going to turn the wheel and raise my needle up as high as I can get it, reach around, raise up the foot, and then I'm going to pull this out. And if it feels a little tight, just take your wheel and kind of jiggle it a little bit, and it'll release that thread. And when I cut with the scissors, I do not want to cut up close to my fabric. I want to leave long threads so that I'll be able to remove those stitches once the pants are finished. So we've got our basting stitches just on one side, long threads on each end, and I'm going to repeat this now on the other 3 seams. Now we're ready for step number 5. And I do vary the instructions at this point because what it says press 1 1/4 inches to the upper edge to the inside, forming a casing. And then it follows by saying press under 1/4 inch on raw edge. Well, we are going to change that a little bit because we have serged the top edge of our pants, and we're not going to need to fold under that 1/4 inch that they mentioned. And I also give them a little bit more room by using a 1 1/2 inch casing. So all of that, we're going to take our sleeve board again because I think that's easier to have the pants on the end of the sleeve board. And we're going to fold down this top edge 1 1/2 inches. So you just need a seam gauge. And a seam gauge is a metal ruler that has a slider on it. So you can put that slider at any point where you want to measure. Now that's one way of measuring. There's all kinds of ways. Here's another one that has it all marked, and you just have to keep turning it to find the one that you want. And ours, we want 1 1/2. So I'm going to use this one for demonstration. So I'm folding it down 1 1/2 inches, and I'm going to use this for my guide right there. That's 1 1/2. And I put the pins at the bottom of the casing. I'm not going to put it at the fold. You want it on the open end of the casing, and we're at a seam. So we want to do our 4 seams first. So I'm going to go around to the next seam, fold it down, and repeat that process, measuring 1 1/2 inches, pinning on both sides of the seam allowance. Continue to go around to the other seam. And pinning on both sides. One more seam. And go back and remember that I mentioned how we like to have our pins 3 to 4 inches apart. So between your seam allowances here, I would say we probably only need 2 pins. We don't need a lot. So yeah, 2 should do it. So I'm gonna do that. Once I finish, I'll go to the iron and press this upper fold before I go to the sewing machine to sew our casing. Next time I talk to you, I'm going to be at the sewing machine ready to sew the casing. Here's another step that I change. And your pattern will show you leaving an opening at the bottom of your casing in order to put your elastic in. And I don't do that. I prefer to have that center back seam open. Remember how I broke the thread to have a hole there. And that's where we're going to put the elastic. So all the bottom edge of the casing is going to be stitched down. And we also are going to add another step, and that we're going to sew at the top edge of the casing as well. And that helps keep the elastic in place. So first off, I need to change my stitch length. It's set right now at the basting stitch length. And I'm just going to turn it back. I like to use 3 for my standard seams. I'm going to need to turn the pants right side out because we're working in a circle. And we're going to start and stop at the center back seam. So we're going to sew the top first. Now, because this machine only has a standard foot, 1/4 inch foot, it has a zipper foot and a walking foot. It does not have what I refer to as an edge foot. But what I do recommend that if your machine comes with an edge foot, definitely use it. It's one of my favorite feet because it will allow you to keep the edge of your fabric right with the edge of the foot. And so you're guaranteed something straight. You're beginning at the center back of the pants, remember that. And we want to make that first stitch to put that needle down in the fabric. I'm not going to reverse at this point. I'm just going to sew all the way around, and then I'm going to go over some of the first stitches, and that will be the same thing as if I reversed. I want to sew that top edge very, very close to the edge. The next step of doing the casing is to, if you're on another machine and have changed your foot to the edge foot, now take that edge foot off and put the general purpose foot back on. And then put the left edge of the general purpose foot at the bottom of your casing, reach around and lower your foot so the edge of the foot is on top of the edge of the casing. Now I'm going to remove the pin. So we're at the center back, that's where we're starting. So I'm not thinking about 5/8, nothing like that. I'm looking at the bottom of that casing, and now I'm going to sew right along that edge. I'm going to take that out. And I also need to back up and tell you, if you've not ever used an edge foot before, you have to move the needle position. You can't forget about that. You have to move your needle over to make sure that your stitches are on the fabric. So that's another step that is necessary. And the only reason I didn't have to do it is because I was not using an edge foot. Be sure you secure your stitches by reversing when you finish. And then you can cut your thread. Now we're ready to get out that elastic and take the elastic out of the package. Now we're ready to put the elastic in the casing. So just get yourself a nice large safety pin, put it on the end, and remember that hole that we have in the center back. You're going to take your left thumb and you're going to push against that end of the safety pin and hold it with your right finger like that. I do that about 3 times and then I pull like that. So I push, 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 pull, push, 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 pull. We're going to go all the way around. Now I've gone all the way around and I'm just going to pull out. And how do you know how much elastic you need to use? And sometimes the patterns will say, you know, measure the waist and subtract 1 or 2 inches. And I don't think that's tight enough. And unfortunately, I can't give you a specific number. I'm afraid I just kind of look at the person and then I pull it and I think, okay, that looks like that ought to fit. And what I'll have them do is I will pin the elastic ends together like this. Tell them to try it on. And then it's kind of like Goldilocks. Does it feel too tight, too loose, or just right? We're going to cut off some of it. Now, I have a different method, again, from what the pattern says, as far as how you join the elastic. Because the pattern will tell you to lap the ends of the elastic over like that. Well, that creates bulk, and I don't care for that. Instead, I want the elastic to meet like this. Just come together. Just kind of the ends kiss, okay? So I've written out some instructions on the process. This is just my personal instruction sheet on how to join your elastic. And you need a small little piece of thin cotton fabric. And also you notice that on this very first step, I have an X marked on each end. And that is so we will make sure when we're sewing the 2 pieces together that we do not twist the elastic when we're making that connection. So I'm going to put an X on each side like that. And now I'm going to cut off the extra. And before I do anything else, I'm going to take the end that I'm not sewing first and I'm pinning it to the pants so that that doesn't come out of the casing as I'm sewing the first end. So here is the first end we're going to stitch, and we're going to take that piece of fabric and we're going to lay it down on the fabric. And this is a situation where my machine only does a straight stitch. And what I've demonstrated here is the zigzag stitch. So I do think the straight stitch can work in this situation. The idea is to get it secure so that the elastic does not pull apart. But these stitches are not going to be seen, so it doesn't really matter what color thread you use. It's going to be inside your casing. Won't make one bit of difference. It won't look pretty, but nobody will ever know. So what's going to happen is you're going to stitch from one edge and go to the other edge, and then you reverse back. So you've actually got 2 rows of stitching there. And once you've done that end, then you're going to repeat it on the other side. And you're actually doing it 3 times. On the first edge, the second edge, and then the third edge is to keep the 2 together. So for sure, your elastic is not going to come apart. So let's go to the sewing machine. I've stitched my elastic together, and I'm just going to trim now the extra fabric. I don't need all that bulk in there. So we're going to take that away. And then I'll be ready to just pop that elastic inside the casing. You don't have to sew the hole together either, because that'll make it really easy when it comes time to putting on the pants to know that that hole represents the center back of the pants. So it pops right in there and you can't even see it. So now you can remove those basting stitches. Remember those basting stitches we did earlier? And you can just pull those little things out. They come out real easily, and get rid of all that extra thread. The last step has to do with your hem. And you don't want your hem to be more than 1.5 inches, because When it gets more than 1.5 inches, it can be a problem about the hem being nice and smooth. All that's left to do is folding up your bottom edge, measuring the depth of what you're going to have for your hem, and then using the straight stitch, stitching right at that top edge of your hem. I'm not going to stitch these because I have someone special who's going to be wearing these pants, and so I want to wait until I can have her try them on before I put the hem in. So that's it. So we have our pants finished, and if you followed me all the way through, you'll agree that it's been so much fun.